You are listening to the Makers Church podcast. For more information about our community, please visit makerschurch.org.
Amen. Good morning, church. You can have a seat. It's so good to be together. If we've never met, my name's Derek, and I'm the lead pastor here at Makers. And if you're new with us, welcome. We're so glad that you are here, and we hope that this becomes a home for you. And we kind of say it every week. We just want you to know that whether you're new or old, that this is your home, this is your family, this is a place that you belong. And we truly hope that you sense that and feel that this morning. And if you're looking to get more connected, we would love to help you with that. So please just say so. You can fill out a Connect card or just come find anybody that looks safe, and we'll invite you in to what God is doing here. If you're new with us, you're joining us in the middle of a conversation we've been in for a few weeks now called Won't You Be My Neighbor? And it's been so much fun talking about what would it look like for us to live out that second part of the great commandment, to love your neighbor as yourself. And I love the way the Message translation says, 1 John 1:14, it says, "And then the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood." And this morning we have an absolute privilege to hear from one of my just great friends, John Huckins. I'm going to invite him up here in a moment, but I'm going to talk about him first. Him and his entire family, John and Jan and their kids, they embody what it looks like to move into the neighborhood. And they've made a profound impact on our lives. When people ask, like, who do you want to be like when you grow up? It's John Huckins. When people say, who do you want to model your family after? It's the Huckins family. They are just absolutely inspiring people that we dearly look up to. And I look to John and to their family a lot of times for cues on how do I navigate this? How do I respond to this? How do I make sense of what it looks to live out the kingdom of God here on earth? And so they're just an incredible family. And it's the cool parts of the history. So Laurel grew up with Jan, and my brother-in-law Danny grew up with John. And now our kids go to school together. It's just wild the way, and it wasn't in San Diego, and the way kind of God has brought this intersection about has just been so fulfilling for us as a family to live and do life near each other and together. And so we have the amazing privilege to hear from John this morning. So let's give him a big round of applause.
Well, I am destined to disappoint you after that introduction. Wow. Thanks, my friend. That's meaningful. As I was standing and celebrating with you through musical worship there, I was reflecting on some of the beauty of this opportunity to come together as the Church of San Diego, like capital C Church. As I think about some of these relationships that Derek even just outlined, many of us represent different gathered communities that are all expressing a larger participation in the church that God has here in the city. Like I have to imagine if the Apostle Paul was writing again to San Diego, it wouldn't be to Makers or to The Rock or to First Press, or it would be to the Church of San Diego, right? And we are all part of that. And I know our family identifies as part of a larger movement, a larger thing that's happening. And then thinking further, knowing the story of these two communities that just became one as a microcosm of God's bigger dream for what the church might be about and what that witness might look like to a watching world, as churches often posture and consume and try to build up walls against one another as if we're like corporate competition. This has been a beautiful picture of the dream that God has in mind for these two communities. And maybe it wasn't two churches becoming one, it was just a return to the church that you always were part of. And so thanks for modeling that. That takes courageous leadership and probably lots of hard questions and maybe some angst and concern, but here we are together, and it's a gift to be part of this. And in the midst of that, in the midst of this microcosm of reconciliation, we live in a conflicted time, do we not? Man, there is stuff raging all around us. Racism is being unmasked in ways that remind us there is still a much deeper disease that needs to be worked on. Partisan divides mark us as more faithful to political party than to our common and collective flourishing as citizens of the kingdom of God. Theological and religious posturing of who's in and who's out, there's these deep diseases, and the symptoms are just showing themselves maybe in some ways that are more tangible than we've experienced in a while. And deep down inside of that, there are these seeds that are germinating that I would argue that Jesus is tossing out into the soil of the Jesus community, reminding us that we are actually to be people that not only tend to the symptoms, but we have something to say about the diseases. That we can be part of healing both our individual brokenness and the systemic conflict and brokenness that's all around us. 5 seconds on our smartphones. You've probably had a couple notifications as we've sat here about what's going on in our world. Our culture, our climate is screaming at us to not only turn a blind eye to our neighbor, but is actually creating divisions between us that would say that our neighbor is our enemy. Now, we follow a Jesus in this world that says in Matthew 25 that the other actually gives us a picture of who God is. That when the world tells us to kill our enemies, Jesus says we are to love and pray for our enemies in Matthew 5. Jesus' attack on the enemy wasn't with a gun, it was with a cross. And Jesus invites us to do the same. So we're invited to actually move toward this conflicted world, not to win or to destroy, but to heal and to transform. We are called to be peacemakers. Now, there's all kinds of cultural stigma around a peacemaker. Some see it as like this 30,000-foot ideal that's associated with unicorns and fairy tales and Volkswagen buses and all this stuff. I would argue that being a peacemaker, moving towards the conflicted reality of our world, is the most subversive and costly acts of discipleship we can say yes to. For us in our neighborhood, we've been in the Golden Hill, Sherman Heights neighborhood for about a decade. And for us and our family, a lot of the stories that I'll share today come out of that context. We're part of a community that commits to live in the same neighborhood and share a common way of life and mission in the way of Jesus. To see our neighbors not as just people we sleep next to, but share life next to and with and common tables. And we do not have it figured out. But we are stumbling our way forward. And for us, you know, this understanding of peacemaking, even in our family, Jan and we have 4 kids, 8-year-old, 6-year-old, and twins that are 3. It's sacred chaos every day. Even getting them into kids' school this morning. I'm sweating right now from that. You know, the idea of being a peacemaker is one of the things they're most energized by. Like they when we wake up in the morning and we drive to school, we're talking about what are ways you're going to live as a peacemaker today. And when we're coming home, it's, hey, how did it go? What did you learn there? And my oldest daughter, Ruby, is someone who talks about this all the time. And when she was graduating from preschool a few years ago, she had this opportunity to invite me to come and share on Career Day. So when she comes home and says, hey, Dad, it's Career Day. Can you come and share about your work as a peacemaker? I'm like, oh, please, no. Seriously? 4-year-olds peacemaking, this is going to be the roughest speaking gig of my life. And so we get there, and there's a stage similar to this, and she's standing next to me with pride and bashful all together. And she said, this is my dad. He's a peacemaker. And I say, yeah, I'm a peacemaker. And in unison, they all yell, he's a pizza maker. And it became really clear it was going to be the hardest speaking gig of my life. And so we're on the stage, and we're like acting out what peacemaking looks like, sharing our stuff, taking care of the person that feels isolated and alone. And I'm thinking, I think they got it. I think these kids got it. We're there. I think it taught peacemaking to 4-year-olds. And as we're walking out, I'm going out the door, and this little bro comes up and whispers in my ear, I like pepperoni. And as hard as it is to talk about peacemaking to 4-year-olds, it's also, if not equally, more difficult to talk about it to people like us. Because in a climate, in a world that says we actually have forgotten about the whole turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, give away everything, we're going to go back to the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth stuff. So this idea of peacemaking is discarded as an afterthought. What I want to talk about today is what is a theology that we might have that invites us to move towards the injustice, the conflict, the division, the disagreement in our own neighborhood, with our neighbors, as everyday peacemakers, people with tools to heal and transform rather than to win or to destroy. A couple weeks ago, Derek talked about this passage in Luke 10, this Good Samaritan story, right? Where he asked the question, who is my neighbor? Because the religious bro, the teacher of the law, was trying to do some judo with Jesus to get out of loving the neighbor that was his actual neighbor. Because it was wildly inconvenient. And for us, boy, it's inconvenient to love the people that look or think or believe or act differently than we do. Today I want to ask the question, what are the practices of being a neighbor? Specifically, how are we living as everyday peacemakers in our neighborhood? And I want to start with, what is this idea of everyday peacemaking? What's the theology for that? What are the practices? I want to get as do some theological work and then get as tangible as possible from there on out. Okay, you with me? Okay, here we go. So, if we look at our biblical story, as we find here in the Bible, the sacred text, we encounter God in the first Genesis, in the creation poems in Genesis 1 and 2. And the Hebrew word here is shalom, that God created all things whole, right? It's this rightly ordered world. And as we go in the story, as humanity grabs for the fruit of power, there's a break in the story, Genesis 3 and beyond. And in that moment, God doesn't put the pencil down and walk away and say, well, that was a failed experiment. Humanity, that was a bad idea. God continues to write the story and writes us into the story as active participants in fixing what we broke. We move forward in Genesis 12 and 13. You hear about Sarah and Abraham and this community of people that are invited to be good news to the world, to be a reflection of a God who is restoring all things back to rights. And the community of God struggles with this vocation, right? As you read throughout the rest of the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, and into the prophets, we encounter the people of God having this dance between exile and restoration. The people of God first in exile with Assyria and then with Babylon. And it's in the oppressed reality of occupation that the prophets begin to speak. Whisper, weep, lament, scream, to remind the people that the God who once saw us back in the garden still sees the humanity and the dignity and the image of God in us. That God is going to immerse into our conflicted story and is going to contend for us to be restored to the way things were created to be all along. It's to note that this community that's giving this lament in the Jeremiahs and the Lamentations, it's the community on the underside of power. Now, many of us read our text because many of us inherited the seat of power, living where we live, or maybe having the kind of economic resources we have, or the color of our skin. The people of God throughout the story that we read in the text are the ones under the boot of power. The immigrants that are on the move, the ones who are constantly being occupied and oppressed by those who have chosen power over faithfulness. So we need to be careful when we read this text, when we are the ones in the seat of power today, not to identify ourselves as the protagonists in the story, but oftentimes we have more in common with the antagonists. So how are we positioning ourselves in our neighborhoods to learn from the people on the underside of power who actually are more reflective of the people of God that we read about in our scriptures? This isn't a natural space for us. It's not natural for us to displace our comfort and our power and our privilege and associate with the people on the underside of power. It is a discipleship journey that requires us saying yes to Jesus every single day. As the story goes, we hear of a Jesus, right, that comes about as the embodiment of a God who has seen our conflicted story, has immersed into the center of it, not in the back of the white horse of the Roman Empire, but in the posture of a child fully reliant on the community he came to restore. And then hangs out there for about 30 years, just as a boy in the Galilee, immerses into the reality of the human neighborhood. And then contends, not through military overthrow, but through suffering and selfless sacrifice, ultimately to bring about a resurrection reality, a restored reality, right? And then we pick it up with the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 5, who's talking to this young community who's trying to figure out how to follow this crazy rabbi who taught a whole different interpretation of their text. And he says to them, remember, you have been reconciled to God, you have been restored, and you have been called to be ambassadors or agents or ministers of reconciliation. Now, for all the different ways we talk about the mission of God, what if the mission of God is restoration and peacemaking is the vocation of God's people? God's mission is to restore what was broken in Genesis 3, and our invitation is to participate in that. So we have to ask a couple questions, and then we'll talk about some practices. What is peace? We define peace as a holistic repair of relationship. There's this beautiful metaphor for peace that we often describe in the context of kintsugi. It's an ancient Japanese art. Some of you might be familiar with it, where someone actually breaks something beautiful, a pot in this case, and then begins to repair it. In the places where the fractures or the conflict or the brokenness once was, it's sealed with seams of gold, reminding us not just of the pain of division, but of the restorative beauty of God's work in the midst of our pain and division and conflict. That what if, in this context, the conflict, when we actually move through the conflict, it gives us the opportunity to experience and participate in God's restoration. So conflict is no longer a problem, it's an opportunity for God's best work in the world. What's peacemaking? Well, peacemaking is moving towards conflict, equipped with tools to heal and to transform. It's a proactive movement. Peace and peacemaking is not passive, friends. It's actually quite disruptive. I would argue that peace and peacemaking requires we disrupt the status quo of peace, this pseudo-peace, this Pax Romana kind of peace, where we get fat and comfortable, not necessarily talking about our bodies, but in the ways that we consume in such a way that reduces the costly, sacrificial nature of following an others-oriented, enemy-loving God. So conflict, again, is not a problem to fix, and it's an opportunity for transformation. As John Paul Lederach would say, conflict is the most dynamic laboratory for genuine relationship. We just need tools to engage it well. So, what are the tools? The first practice I'm going to invite you to consider, there's 4 of them, is to simply see. It's to see the humanity and the dignity and the image of God in everyone. For us, if we go back to Luke 10 and the Good Samaritan story, that was what gave the Samaritan the leg up here, right out of the gate. There was all sorts of stuff that got in the way of the religious folks, not simply seeing the humanity and the dignity and the image of God of the beaten, broken, dying man on the side of the road. And most notably, it was probably their religiosity. They didn't want to be inconvenienced with something that might compromise their ritual purity. Well, what if caring for the broken person on the side of the road is actually a reflection of the faith that we're saying yes to? The Samaritan actually saw the humanity and the dignity and the image of God in this person. And Jesus, we see this over and over and over. In John 4, Jesus sees the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in the Samaritan woman, who's not only considered a half-breed as a Samaritan, but as a woman who's a second-class citizen in that context, who's been married multiple times, who's out during the day. Jesus actually puts his life on the line by consuming the water that she gave him. Jesus put his life in the hands of the other or the enemy, and didn't assign her dignity, but just pointed a finger at the dignity that she already had, that we hadn't had the eyes to see. Jesus saw the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in tax collectors who were literally in cahoots with the empire, exploiting the people. Jesus saw the executioner who's putting him to death on a cross as he prays, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Throughout the Gospels, Jesus is healing sight. Jesus is the sight healer who's doing some work on the cataracts that we have had grow in our eyes through partisan politics and divided theologies and ethnic barriers and racism and all these things. Jesus is here to heal our sight. For 20 years, I lived in Salinas, California, the lettuce capital of the world. I went to high school in Casterville, the artichoke capital of the world, next to Gilroy, the garlic capital of the world. And between every one of my 5 stops each day, the beach, the golf course, home, school, and church, I would see fields as far as the eye could see. And in those fields were people bent over picking the food I would eat for dinner that night. And for 20 years, I noticed them. I didn't see them. I didn't see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in them. I didn't know that they were living in the overcrowded apartments in the shadows of my neighborhood. It wasn't until we began to walk with our neighbors in our neighborhood. What did it mean to see our neighbors? Well, we came to find out as a community in the way of Jesus who's learning how to see again, that we had to do some work. We had to study everything from literally going to the library and studying old police records about the story of our neighborhood, to walking down the street and talking to the liquor store owner who's been there for 40 years and asking him what it was like here before the gentrification reality of the last 20. And then we just had to live life on the streets, in the community centers, at Zumba classes, at karate. And we find out that most of our neighbors are Latino. Many of them are undocumented. One of these families became some of our closest friends. In fact, our families became so interdependent that it was no birthday party would start or end without the other one being there. This family, mom and dad undocumented, 5 kids are documented, became central players in who we found ourselves to be in our neighborhood. They introduced us to most of our neighbors. They are our mentors, our guides into the reality of what it means to be a good neighbor. As I reflect on this, I have to come to terms with the fact this practice of seeing forces us to ask the question, who have I been taught to see and who have I been taught not to see? Wow. And this is why it's a discipleship confessional question, right? What's the stuff inside of me that's kept me from seeing people like this family who for 20 years I drove by and now they're around our table and we see the flourishing and future of our kids as interdependent? What has kept me from seeing the way Jesus sees? What's the stuff that I have held as more important than my ability to simply interact with my other in such a way that we see our humanity mutually? It's easy for us to get into spaces where we know someone disagrees with us. They're on the other side of the political aisle or a theological aisle or whatever it might be, and we don't actually see them. They are our other, and we've already classified them as such. The question we have to ask is, what's the work we need to do to unmask the stuff inside of us that's keeping us from seeing them? Jean Vanier, he's a theologian and community practitioner, says, we create enemies because we haven't confronted the enemy within us. So who is our other? If we're going to be good neighbors, we should probably see them. And it might first begin with seeing the brokenness in ourselves that needs to be confronted, confessed of, repented of, and lived. What are some practices of seeing? This could be really tangible. If you got a notepad, here's some ideas for what practices of being a good neighbor. Go to your library and study the history of your neighborhood. What if you were actually placed, as Derek said a couple weeks ago, in your neighborhood for a reason? If God has you there on those streets to be a neighbor, not just to the person on the other side of the city, but to the proximate neighbor above or below or beside you. What's the history of this place? What's the communities that have been displaced so that I could live there? Let's do the work. It's probably not going to be fun. It's probably going to be challenging. That's the invitation we're invited into. Diversify our news sources. Something I found is it's hard for us to see our neighbor if we're just looking through life through our own narrative. Even on your app, diversify what you got on there and how that impacts the realities of your streets. Go on neighborhood walks with your smartphone and pay attention to what is beautiful and what is broken. Snap a picture of the beautiful, of the broken. Bring it back to your family, your community. Process that. Why is it beautiful? Why is it broken? How are we part of that? How are we holding all of that in tension? Those that live on our streets, what if a practice of seeing is simply to avoid the 1,000-foot stare that many of us say yes to because it's more convenient? It's really inconvenient to look someone in the eye because it might require we interact with them. What if a practice is simply to look them in the eye? This is not like, this isn't some academic like 401 concept. This is just what it means, I would argue, to follow Jesus in the most practical, mundane realities of our lives in our neighborhood. When we recover our sight and see the way Jesus sees, we will find that the other, that our neighbor that we have othered, isn't a problem to fix, but an opportunity to embrace. Second practice. Everyday peacemakers move toward conflict equipped with tools to heal and transform rather than to win or to destroy. This, again, in the Good Samaritan story in Luke 10, the Good Samaritan saw the humanity and the dignity and the image of God in this person, and then the text says he went. He actually made a physical movement toward. That's an intentional decision he made to step off the path of convenience and into the path of reality that might cost him something. We see this, ultimately in incarnation. If we trust that Jesus is the embodiment of a living God, God moves into the conflicted reality of our world. And then we ask, how did he move into our world? He does it as a vulnerable child, and then is just there. Literally 10 times more time spent as a neighbor in the Galilee than as a prophetic minister for his last 3 years. We have a lot to learn about neighboring from Jesus' first 30 years that can absolutely inform how we choose to remain for the long haul on our streets and in those relationships. Also, we understand that God in Jesus is moving towards the other, the people who have demonized and become those that are running counter to his vision for the world. God moves towards them. Who are the people, who are the neighbors in our lives that look or think or believe or act differently than we do? And somehow in our head, we've said, well, as a Christian, it would compromise our faith it might slide us down the slippery slope to be close to people who look or think or believe or act differently than we do. I would argue it doesn't compromise our faith. It reflects the very best of it. It doesn't reflect a strong faith, but a fragile one. When we live in insular bubbles where we can talk in our own insider Christianese language. Friends, we're not called to be safe. We're called to be faithful. It might cost us everything. For Jesus, it did. So what are ways that we are actually immersing into the pain, the brokenness, the conflict, the realities of our neighborhood and our neighbors as a reflection of God's restorative mission? Really tangibly, what are ways that we can end up around those tables and with people we might disagree with, neighbors we might disagree with, listen longer than feels comfortable? That person starting to spout out again. Sometimes it's Uncle Jim at the Thanksgiving table. Sometimes it's the neighbor across the street. And you're like, I cannot hear it. Listen longer. Yeah. What if we enter into those spaces, as St. Francis would say, seeking to understand rather than to be understood? Because we go into those relationships with our neighbors with agendas. Let's release our hands and open it up to what the Spirit might be doing by seeking to understand these folks and where they're coming from and understand that their flourishing is connected to mine. There is a massive, we might literally share a wall with someone, but we have a proximity gap with our us and our them. And we are called as everyday peacemakers to literally collapse the gap between us and them. I love the way that Father Greg Boyle says, there is no us and them, there is only us. It goes back to the church conversation, right? There's no individual churches, there is only the church. I was with a friend of mine, his name is Sheikh Ehab. I lead a peacemaking training organization. One of the ways we teach this is to go to the center of global conflicts and learn from the peacemakers embedded within them. One of them, his name is Sheikh Ehab, and he's a lecturer at Al-Aqsa Mosque. He's a Muslim. He's one of the most prolific academics in all of Islam, and we were sitting with him in Jerusalem. It's the third most holy site in all of Islam. And I was there with a delegation of Christian pastors that were there with us on this peacemaking training. And I asked the sheikh, I said, hey, there's this disease in the States right now that's paralyzing us. It's compromising our witness. It's called Islamophobia. We're scared of you. Will you help us with that? Like, what's some tips for us to not be as scared of you? And his response to us, you need to stop hearing about us and start hearing from us. He was inviting us to proximity. He was inviting us to share a table. How might we share tables? We often say that the table is the most important piece of furniture in the kingdom of God. Our immerse practices are going to be reflective in who's sharing our tables on a week in and week out basis on the streets of our neighborhood. What are some practices of immersion? Become students of your neighborhood. Consider it your classroom. You are not the colonizer, you are the collaborator. Be that as a student. Make a long-term commitment to live there, if you can. Be someone who becomes a marker on the streets, in the soil of that space. What does it look like to immerse in your neighborhood? What if we try to shop locally with those in that space, not only because we want the money to go a certain direction, but because we want to actually build the relationships with those that are guiding the economic infrastructure of our space. Another practice, identify the assets that are already there. Sometimes us as church folk, we like to go to a neighborhood and then like paste our brand on it and say we're going to start a new program. What if instead of doing that, we actually immerse such that we learn that there's already 10 other nonprofits doing the work that we don't have to restart, but we can be the best volunteers imaginable. Identify the assets in your space and be a neighbor. When we do this, it actually creates the soil for what we call uncommon friendships. What are those friendships where you just shouldn't be friends, but you are? This, for us, is our friend who I mentioned earlier, who's undocumented. I'm not, for the sake of her flourishing, I'm not using her name. But for us, as we entered into this reality of our neighborhood, it woke us up to the reality of the undocumented people who we love like sisters and brothers. It led us to understand that we, as San Diegans, actually live in a binational metropolis with Tijuana. If we're talking about neighborhood, if you look at San Diego, Tijuana, we are one large metropolitan city, interdependent politically, economically, socially, relationally, spiritually. So if we're going to be good neighbors, it means on our streets, and it also means with our sisters and brothers south of the border. And now that I'm connected to it, and we are connected to it with a family, it means something, not just on a political partisan, I don't care about that, but I care about this family and their flourishing. And we were, there's two friends of mine. One, his name is Professor Jamie Gates. He's a professor at Point Loma Nazarene. Another is Chief Rodney Scott. He's the Border Patrol Chief in San Ysidro. They think very differently than one another about immigration and border. In fact, how they met was, Jamie was at the border as part of a protest, protesting migrant rights in the way they weren't cared for. Rod Scott was down there identifying the protest and was about to go down and detain some of the protesters when he saw that the van said Point Loma Nazarene University on it. And Rod says, wait a minute, I'm a Nazarene. In fact, as he got closer, he noticed it was Professor Jamie Gates, who is his kid's Sunday school teacher at their Nazarene church. And in the context of this very polarized and dividing issue, an uncommon friendship grew. Rather than just demonize each other, they sat around a table. A couple of years ago, we actually did a podcast with them modeling what uncommon friendship can look like for Christianity today. It's incredible. I highly recommend you listen to it. They still think so differently about this. But in the context of immersion, the equity of our relationship is more important than the equity of our partisan politics. Third practice, and I know I got to wrap it up here, so we're going to blaze through these last two. Everyday peacemakers stand in front of any bulldozer that flattens people. We contend not by getting even, but getting creative in love. For the Good Samaritan, it looked very tangible. He went and he bandaged. He clothed. He cured. He put this man on his donkey and hiked down the Jericho road. For Jesus, Matthew 5, contending, again, didn't look like getting even. It looked like getting creative in love. It looked like turning the other cheek, walking the extra mile, giving away everything. It looked like a cross, not a sword. We have to ask, how are we, having seen and immersed into the realities of our neighborhood, how are we now rolling up our sleeves and fighting for justice? Not just justice for the sake of justice, but because if we are actual neighbors with someone, we care about their reality in such a way that's connected to our faithfulness. It was about 5 months ago that we got a text. We were gathering with our church, and our friend texted and said, I accidentally crossed the border. This mother of 5 kids who's undocumented. I was driving and I plugged in the wrong address in my GPS, and I'm now in Tijuana. And 3 of my kids are with me. What do I do? We said, stay there. We're on the way. So we run out of our little gathering and we drive down to the streets of Tijuana, and she is weeping because she knows that she drove herself to her own deportation. And we wept with her. What did it mean to contend at this point? Well, one, it meant to cry. It meant to lament. But it also meant that our neighborhood community said, we're bringing meals to that family because now there's a dad who's undocumented with 5 kids by himself 2 blocks from our house. And they're not going to worry about food. And we're going to find an apartment in Tijuana so she can be comfortable and safe. We're going to get sentries for the kids so they can go visit their mom as much as possible. Contending became very tangible. As we contend, we discover, and even as we were in this process with them, oftentimes we'd have the meal train and we'd drop off the meal with her husband, and he was so deeply grateful. There was this residue of mistrust that happens between people in power and that look like me and people like him that was breaking down the barriers between us and them. And then he began to contend for us. He would often say, "Thank you for this food. When is your community meeting? Because I'm going to bring your guys' meal." So we're like, "Please stop." No. He would not let us stop. And so he began to bring meal to our church gatherings on Sunday nights. Contending for one another is mutual. Like this power dynamic begins to flatten in the economy of the kingdom. So may we contend. What does it look like to contend for your neighbors? I can't tell you how to contend for your neighbors because you have to be the ones in relationship with them discerning what contending looks like. We oftentimes get these pre-diagnoses going on. I know the problem. I know the answers to other people's problems. We don't until we're in relationship. So do the work of seeing and immersing and then contend in ways that are reflective of your collective future together. The last practice. Everyday peacemakers share tables with former enemies and celebrate the big and small ways God is healing our broken world. For Jesus, restoration is a picture of resurrection reality. It's a reality that has both come and is coming, and it's something we participate in every day. It's the mustard seeds of the kingdom that are getting tossed out every single moment by this community. And when we see them germinate and turn into something beautiful, we would be wise to celebrate them like crazy. Because if there's anything we know, is that every story doesn't end in restoration, not on this side of things. So when we see and experience restoration, you as a community are responsible to celebrate it because that's the fuel that's going to guide us into our continual discipleship journey as living as everyday peacemakers, as those who are oriented to and for and alongside our neighbors as part of a much bigger story of restoration. I'll close with this. It was 2 weeks ago that we heard a knock on our door. And 2 of this woman's kids were there, which is not uncommon to drop something by or whatever it might be. And as they came in, we heard one more knock, and she looks around the corner, and we see our friend back at our door. It's a long story. I'm not going to share it here. But the next night, we threw this celebration around our table with neighbors, with her 5 kids, her husband, it was actually Mother's Day that she came back. Imagine that picture of restoration, a mother reunited with her kids. A husband and wife back together, and we were back around a table, and we couldn't help but think this is what the kingdom of God looks like. There's no more borders and boundaries and partisan politics and theological us and thems. There is only the vision of restoration that God is weaving into the story of our shared humanity every single day in our streets. So I'll close with this image of Kintsugi going back on the screen. Friends, we are invited, we are called to be everyday peacemakers who see, immerse, contend, and participate in God's restoration. Restoration isn't something we do, it's something we participate in. God is the one that does it. And he's going to begin to put things back together the way they were originally created to be. And we're going to see the conflict and the brokenness and the pain and the division, not for the pain that it once was, but for the beautifully restorative work that it reflects, that we are beautiful and stronger than we were before the break. This idea of Ubuntu, it's the African idea of Desmond Tutu talks to us about. When I think about being neighbors, we understand that I am because we are. We are restored because this family is restored. They are restored when our family is restored. We are in it together on our streets and around our tables and in our world. I want to invite the prayer team to come up. I'm going to close this with a benediction. If any of you are feeling that tension of pain or conflict on your streets, around your tables, that weight of conflict that stirs up anxiety when we say the name of that person, you're not called to hold that alone. There's an opportunity for healing. If you need prayer towards those ends, if you need prayer for anything, that guides us towards being neighbors as reflective of God's mission. Come on up. Would everyone else stand with us as we say this prayer together? Not only a prayer that I offer over the community, but that we collectively celebrate as San Diegans. So friends, may we see conflict not as a problem to fix, but as an opportunity for transformation. May we welcome the strangers among us and embrace them as neighbors. May we reject the paralysis of fear and be moved by our mandate to love. May we listen longer than feels comfortable and seek to understand rather than to be understood. May we be known by our invitation rather than our isolation. May we lean into deep relationships that transcend our borders and our boundaries. And may we live as instruments of peace here in North Park, in San Diego, in our world. Amen.
You are listening to the Makers Church podcast. For more information about our community, please visit makerschurch.org.